Well, hello everybody. I'm Caroline Winter and I'm very honoured to be your moderator for this discussion with our panel of award-winning freelance journalists. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm zooming, which is that of the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also pay my respects to their elders of all of the nations of the people around Australia, because of course today we're joined by participants from right across the country. Today's webinar is presented by the Walkley Foundation and is supported by Media Super, and in a moment you'll hear briefly from them. After that you'll meet our speakers and we'll move into a panel discussion for just under an hour before we open up for questions from you at around 1:45 p.m. Eastern. So you can type your questions in the chat and you can do that as we go along, and we'll come to those at the end and I'll pose them to our panel of guests. But first, let's hear from Jenny Farrar, who is Media Super's Stakeholder Relationship Manager and Education Specialist. Jenny, thanks for being here.
Thank you and welcome everyone, and thanks Carolyn for that nice introduction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. As Carolyn's outlined, I'm a Stakeholder Relationship Manager and Education Specialist for CBUS and Media Super. And you may be aware that Media Super merged with CBUS on the 11th of April last year. I worked at Media Super prior to the merge, and prior to that worked at the MEAA for close to 16 years. So I've got a great understanding of the issues affecting journalists and our industry. I'd like to take the opportunity to provide a brief update of Media Super, highlight some of the ways you can get the most out of your super, and invite you along to our education webinars. So Media Super, as many of you know, is the fund for those who work in print, media, entertainment, arts and the broader creative industries. Though our membership base is formed mainly by various creative fields, everyone's welcome to join. Some of you may recall when the fund was established, it was known as the Journalist Super Trustee, Just Super, which was created in 1987 for journalists by journalists. Now with the merge with CBUS, we have over 68 years of experience and shared commitment to our industries. This commitment's highlighted through the breadth and strength of our connections with not only industry partners like the Walkley Foundation, but also our commitment to investing within our industry. And being part of a larger and growing fund means greater value for our members who now have access to a broader range of services. And we've also had a reduction in administration fees and a whole range of other things, which we'll invite you to some webinars to learn more about later. One of the major benefits too, other than with the services, is that you can walk into a Media Super office within one of many of our major capitals across the country. So if you've got any issues, you can just pop into the office and catch up with our friendly member services team who will help manage your concerns. Now, we've found that whether you're self-employed or under fixed-term contract, it's even more important to understand your super, the insurances that are available to you, and what a comfortable retirement looks like when you slow down with your work or you want to retire. So what we do is we offer a series of education sessions, and Claire's going to pop a link in the chat, which will send you to our Media Super website. It's got a calendar of all sorts of education that you can attend. So from the basics, including how to boost and consolidate your super, what sort of insurance needs there are, but I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at that. And as part of our relationship with the Walkley Foundation, we're offering a webinar next Thursday, the 27th, and that will be focusing on how to get the most out of your super, and also understanding insurance within your superannuation. Steve Smith, he's one of our educators who's based in Brisbane. He's got over 25 years of experience. So come along with all your questions and I'm sure they can all be answered. So Claire will pop that link in as well, and you'll see that in the Walkley newsletter. Just to finish up, it's the beginning of a new financial year, so I just wanted to provide you with a brief update. on our performance. And despite the challenging market conditions over the past 12 months, we're really pleased to be able to have delivered a healthy financial return of 8.95% this year. And that's on our default growth, My Super investment option. So that's a terrific outcome for our members. Now, if you're interested in an end of year financial webinar, we also have one of those next week. So just once again, pop across to the education calendar and you can book into those. So I just wanted to say thanks for your time this afternoon. It's really a privilege to be able to speak with you and be in a position to support members across our industry. And I hope I've given you a quick snapshot of the fund and how you can support yourself on your journey with your superannuation. So in closing, thanks to the Walkley Foundation and also to Carolyn and the fantastic panel members that you've got lined up today. I look forward to catching up.
Lovely, Jenny, thank you so much. And those details are now in the webinar chat. Just a reminder, for any questions that you have as we go along, please pop them in chat as we do go along. When we come to the end, we'll have time for questions from the floor. Well, to our topic today, freelancers in the eye of the storm. Over the next hour, we're going to hear from our panel of freelancers about reporting on natural disasters, some of the strategies and tools that can help when covering floods and bushfires, not just during, but well after those events have passed. And we'll also talk more broadly about freelancing and the intricacies of going out on your own. I'd like to introduce you to our guests first, before we get into questions, of course. Natalie Grono is a freelance photojournalist and the 2022 Nikon Walkley Photo of the Year winner, who shot the flooding in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales last year. Hi, Nat.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Susanna Freymark runs independent local news site indianr.com in northern New South Wales and covered the 2019 bushfires and the 2022 floods and produced the film Tinny Heroes. Hi, Susanna.
Hi, Caroline.
And Daniel Clark is a journalist and filmmaker whose film Lost in the Woods about the Kangaroo Island timber plantations is just about to be released. As you were saying earlier, it's being uploaded as we speak. And he was recently named the South Australian 2023 Journalist of the Year at the SA Media Awards. Hi, Dan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Welcome to all of you. Look, I'd like to start by asking how you became a freelancer. What was your path to getting here? Nat, we might start with you.
Yeah, right. Well, I spent many years as a staff photographer at the Newcastle Herald. So that's how I kind of cut my teeth in the, in the photojournalistic world. And then came the time when I started my family and I always wanted to live in the Northern Rivers. And so I just jumped at that chance. And to be honest, I didn't even expect to get much freelance work. I was probably just going to stay in motherhood for a few years and then try something else. But as I arrived here, I found that there's always stories to be covered. So the freelance work just kept kind of coming. And yeah, so I've decided to stick with it. And it is what I love. So I'm glad that I am in an area where I still get to work, still get to be a mum and be around and do all those glorious things. So yeah.
Lovely. And Susanna, what about you? How did you get to this point?
Well, I was a school teacher in a previous life, which seems a long time ago. And obviously I loved teaching literacy, particularly writing. And I realised I wanted to write myself and I wanted to earn a living out of my words. So I love fiction. I've written a book as well, but I just love working with words. So I started freelancing in London where I was living. I grew up in South Australia, but then I came back to Australia, freelanced for a few years, went and got my actual media degree, and then I worked for News Corp, or APN it was then, and then I worked for News Corp for years and years, and I ended up as editor of the News Corp paper Express Examiner in Casino. And in my, it would have been my 5th year there, which I loved the job. I'd never been editor of a country paper before, absolutely loved it. Of course, it was one of those papers that got axed and in its 150th year. So the community, we started our own print paper and that went for 1.5 years. But when COVID came, we just couldn't get the advertising and the money to keep it going. So because I love rural news and like being very local, I started a website called indianr.com, which covers Richmond Valley and Kyogle. And all I can say is I earned a lot more money when I was a teacher than when as a freelance journalist, but I have the best job in the world.
So many things to unpack there. We'll ask some questions off the back of that. Dan, what about you? The path to freelancing, what was that like for you?
Yeah, a little bit similar. I started my career at the Advertiser newspaper in Adelaide, did the cadetship there for 3 years and hung around for another 2, and then went traveling, sort of needed to go out and see the world, I think, after that. And drove around, did a little bit of freelancing while I was driving around Australia, but I moved into sort of communications a little bit in Melbourne. But then I moved up into the APY lands, which is Aboriginal lands right at the top of South Australia. And there I'd always had a love for making films and getting the camera out and just shooting around. And I saw the opportunity arose. NITV was starting up just at the same time, and I was sort of the only one out there who could sort of handle the camera, and was teaching the young kids how to use it. And we sort of ended up making a few films for NITV, and it kind of just sort of blossomed from there, sort of moving into the filmmaking side of things and starting up our own business. And then ended up a little bit the same as Nat, sort of moved to Kangaroo Island because we were starting a young family and wanted something new, and had the same kind of feeling of, is there going to be enough work for us here? Or, is there enough stories? But in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, it's just been from story to story. So I sort of got back into a bit of writing now as well, which is great, just sort of getting that love back, but also making films at the same time. So a bit of a juggling act with some of my other work, but it's working really well.
And Dan, just in terms of, going, down the path of becoming a freelancer, is it sort of a balance between the freedom and the fear almost?
Yeah, it definitely is. I think, I worked for 8 years full time doing the filmmaking, and that requires obviously you making money through doing a few sort of small business ads and working for the government, maybe doing a bit of stuff with schools. So just to keep that money coming in. But I guess the hardest thing for most people, and what I've found, is you don't know when the money's coming in, and it comes in big lots, and so you're sort of having to budget along the way and not really knowing. But I think if you're motivated enough and you've got the right contacts and you're looking for opportunities, and I think you can obviously do it. Obviously the three of us here have probably proved that.
Absolutely, you have. Nat, I might come to you for this next one, but when we talk about covering disasters, and you've kind of been in the midst of it, as Susanna has been in the last 18 months, what's it like in terms of the role for a freelancer in covering disasters, especially in regional areas and in communities in which you're very close to?
Yeah, well, I guess like the floods last year, it was very strange because there was just communication breakdown. Nobody knew what was happening initially, and in the area that I was sent to, the telecommunications went down, and I remember you get like a frantic phone calls from nearly every picture editor in the country. And I've always had a thing of like, whoever rings me first, I'll work with for that day. So and then you'd only be able to talk to them in the morning and set out, and then you'd have no communication with them. You couldn't file, and really just relying on, for me, it was relying on the people that I would see. Like, so everybody that was going through it that you'd come across, you'd have to rely on their information. And yeah, like I remember in the floods, I'd be out all day shooting, and then I wouldn't be able to file and get back in contact with my editor until like 6 o'clock that night. I'd have to drive to the top of a hill somewhere where there was a reception. And then, normally before freelancing, you're working with a journalist with you. So this is always strange, because when you're rural, you're often on your own. So you're, as a photojournalist, you're collecting information and sending that back to somebody that, you're not even talking to, that's in Sydney or Melbourne. And that can be very strange too, because there's just, especially with the floods, I had no idea what was happening in other parts of the Northern Rivers, and then coming back and maybe hearing about it the next day on the news or something would be like news for me as well.
I'll come back to you in just a moment, Nat. Susanna, I want to go to you as well, also being involved in covering the floods last year and bushfires of 2019. As a freelancer, what Nat's saying, I'm sure, resonates with you. How is it different in doing it as a freelancer as opposed to being under, a media banner or a newspaper or a broadcaster?
Well, when I did the fires in 2019, I was with News Corp. So of course you check your editor. There was a whole lot of legalities about the fire suit, a whole lot of things. As a freelancer, you sort of chuck that out the window because I'm only accountable to myself. So it's really different because I'm making all the decisions, and I find running a news website, I have to be a little bit good at everything, whether it's a headline, how I'm going to package the story. I don't have a photographer with me, have to do my own photos. So it's all done on the smell of an oily rag. But you head out, like fortunately, in the floods, my home, I'm in a little village that is up high. I don't know how I would have coped if I had been flooded myself, because I had a home to come to. I was isolated by a landslip on the Bruxner Highway, but I'd take this goat track to Coracai and Woodburn and places that were very flooded. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. It was really hard to keep that, that journalist distance, because, I mean, I've worked in my patch now for 8 years, so you know the people roughly. It was absolutely heartbreaking. Like, you'd come home, you'd have mud all over you. I would cry in the car on the way home. I'd get home, it was like, get on with it and write the stories. And the responsibility I felt, the weight of it, of getting that story right, it was just huge, because I was so affected personally by it. And I had to just put that to one side. So it was the first time that, like, when I arrived at Coracai, when I finally got in, it was 3 days after the flood. People were walking around in shock. It was like a bomb had gone off. The place was a mess. It stank of dead cows. And they all wanted to talk to you because there were very few journalists in there. And it was the first time ever in my career that I couldn't take photos. I don't know if Natalie's had this. And I was holding my camera like this going, oh my God, like I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then, of course, it kicks in, because I'm a big believer in bearing witness, and you've got to take photos. You've got to capture what's going on. So once I started taking pictures, I got that distance, because once you're behind the camera, all my emotions were put to one side. So once that kicked in, I was really good. But I had about half an hour where I was just gutted by what I was seeing, and the people coming up saying, I've been on my roof for 3 days and no one came to save me. It was big. I don't think I've even processed it yet, actually, and that was 18 months ago.
No, I'm sure not. Thank you for sharing that with us. And just off the back of that, Susanna, there's obviously, as you say, that responsibility as a reporter, but someone who lives in that community or lives with those people, the difficulties of doing the job you've explained really, really well. Do you think, though, that it makes you, when you can take that step back, makes you almost a more empathetic or a better storyteller because you have that connection?
That's an interesting question. Well, when I write the stories, are the same as when I did the Tinny Heroes film, I'm very aware of my audience. It's a local audience. I don't really care what people overseas or in the city think about my stories. I care about my readers. So when I write that story, they're in my mind. So knowing them is really important in terms of getting that story right. But the distance is also important in terms of me getting my stuff out of the way and going, okay, this isn't about you, this is about them. So it's an interesting process, and it's one I really like, because you've got to be aware of yourself, but it's always about the readers, always, and not necessarily just the people affected, but who's reading the story, what do they need to hear. And I'm always mindful of any sensitivities in terms of the people, because unlike when I worked at Holt Street in Sydney, I see these people again every week. It's not like in the city where you don't see them again. So it's an interesting position to be in. But the thing I found, which I love about country journalism, is when you turn up to a place, they love that you've come there. They love that you're going to tell their story. There's none of this, oh God, a journalist is here. They absolutely are thrilled that you care enough to turn up. So that's a huge validation of the work any of us do.
Mm.
Nat, I just want to pick up on something that you said before, that sort of around the logistics of reporting while a disaster is unfolding. You mentioned, no power, the phone service. How is it that you can work and file in those conditions, particularly when you're doing that on your own?
I don't know, to be honest. I look back and think, how did that all happen? Yeah, I remember, because I'd have to do a lot of wading in and walking, and carrying that equipment, for one, is really hard going, especially when you're wading through flood water. after the rain had stopped, it was actually really hot as well. So there were no shops to stop, get lunch, get water, go to the toilet or any of that. So I had to kind of like bear all that in mind as I was moving around, you know, make sure I had enough storage. Batteries weren't going to run out. Wasn't too easy to like be able to swap batteries in the water or anything like that. So yeah, as I said, I couldn't actually file until nighttime anyway, because there was no internet, there was none of that. So that was good, one thing. And it was actually good that I didn't have an editor, couldn't ring me and hound me every 10 minutes and ask me what was happening, which can be, I mean, I know I can understand their role, but at the same time, when you're out trying to capture something as mammoth as that, the last thing you want is to be answering those kind of phone calls every 10 minutes. So that was one blessing in disguise. It kind of gave me the freedom to be able to just really move around and talk to people and capture what I was seeing without that stress of I have to file every half hour. So yeah, but yeah, as it is really hard as a freelancer, because you're the only one that's going to be accountable for your own safety. And when you're working for a company or something, you're always provided, like I know when I photographed the Rappville fires up here, and you don't have your own fire gear or something like that. It's normally you're sent off in a car that has all that stuff in the back. So you really have to think about all of these things beforehand before you get there, because nobody else is going to.
I'd like to talk a bit more about that, Dan. I will come to you in a moment. But Nat and Susanna, what should be in your disaster reporting toolkit, for want of a better term, when you're thinking about heading into this sort of environment? And like you say, Nat, without the backing of a big organisation behind you.
I think you have, oh, sorry, you go, Natalie.
No, I was just going to say probably all the things I don't have. Yeah, no, it's essential, especially fire equipment, to have all your fire equipment with you. For the floods, it was, so unexpected. I was just grateful that I had a pair of gumboots, to be honest. That was my savior, and that's pretty much all I had. Yeah.
And Susanna?
Well, I think you have to, because it's easy, and I'm terrible at taking care of myself in those things, because, once you're behind the camera, you just get lost in wanting to get that shot. But I think you do, before you go out, you do have to treat yourself as if it's someone you love. So I have a fire suit, which cost me a lot of money, but the Walkley Foundation made a Facebook fund. That was part of my grant. That was a great thing to get, because I would not have been able to afford that. So I have a fire suit now. I think the most important thing for me is to stay hydrated. So lots and lots of water, because when the fires and the floods, there is no water, and any water that is there is for the people who've been through it. And I think one of the worst things in terms of your thinking is if you're starting to get dehydrated. So for me, water would be the thing.
Absolutely. Dan, let's come to you. There's been a lot of talk just in the last while about connecting with community and being immersed in a community. Now, you've all been involved in telling stories during natural disasters, either during or after, or in your case, Dan, quite some time after, but it's still during the toughest of times. So what is it that you're thinking about when you're heading into a place to tell a story, a difficult story, after, the limelight has gone and major media organisations have disappeared?
Yeah, well, that's actually that last point is my most important point, I think, because what I've found in this local community was that, they had all this attention after the big fires here, the Black Summer fires. Everyone was here, the media was here, the outpouring of love from everyone. And then within a couple of weeks, gone, nothing. They just left. And they felt like they were sort of forgotten, especially with COVID kicked in. And there was a lot of isolation from that point. And I think the really important point is to be still involved with the community and going out there and finding stories in the aftermath about the rebuild, rather than just, we've forgotten about it and moved on to the next big story. And I think that's where obviously regional journalists and freelance journalists is the most important role for them. What I found talking to the locals is that in some ways, and it can be a dangerous thing, but it's as a journalist, you're almost like a counsellor. These guys, I've gone out to farmers who have never spoken about what's happened. and they just suddenly open up. And whether, I don't know what that is, I've even had a camera on them. It seems like a camera, they open up in front of the camera. They feel like it's, you know, someone that's not close to them. Maybe it's not a family member. It's not a close friend, and they can feel like they can talk more openly. And they felt like at the end of it, they felt better for getting it out. So I think that's what's come across in terms of what I've come across. And just, sorry, touching back as well to when you mentioned about going out as a freelancer. And I think I've found that in these sort of situations, editors don't really care where you are as a freelancer. And I think that's the biggest difference between working for someone, a big organization, and not. And then that's the dangerous thing, because you end up going places and nobody knows where you are. So I think that's a really dangerous thing. But on the other hand, when I was working for the Tiser, I remember going to a fire and the CFS called us to a safe spot, and we all came to the safe spot as a media crew. And then within a second, the fire was coming down the hill and actually went over the top of us. And they were telling us to run into our cars and go hide in our cars. So even in that situation, where the CFS is telling you to stand, you might not be safe either. So I guess it's those are the things to be aware of.
Oh, absolutely. Wow, that would have been a very frightening situation.
It wasn't you, but...
Yes, absolutely. Dan, in your disaster reporting toolkit, or even freelancer reporting toolkit, when you think about those things, I mean, what sort of preparations are you doing then before you hit the ground? And as you point out, you know, you're being a social worker, a counsellor, as well as a filmmaker and a storyteller.
Yeah, for sure. Well, in terms of movement, I'd definitely be, the advice would be to keep your family updated about where you're heading to. And in some ways, you don't know how people are going to react when you go out to these areas as well. Like, I remember I went out to the fire field sort of a week or two after, and it was amazing how it was still so empty. There was nobody around. And a lot of that was that people couldn't go back to their houses. They didn't want to go back to their farms. And driving around, you felt like you were the only one out there, apart from, you know, some army were around and CFS. So it was really about identifying who might be around, who might be willing to talk, and dropping into these farms and having a chat. But another warning story with that is that the other thing with freelancers is you're often in an unmarked car. So nobody knows who you are, you're not identifiable. And I had an interesting story where I almost got in a little bit of trouble because I was driving around the fire area, and there was a call out on the CFS saying there's a silver Holden Commodore acting suspiciously driving around. It would have looked very suspicious because I was driving around and taking photos of various spots, and they thought there might have been an arsonist, because there was an arsonist around at the time. So that's another thing to really be aware of, and probably that's up to me. I should have told CFS that that's what I was doing, told the police that I was going to be out there in this particular car. So that's another probably point that I learned along the way. And just one more point on that was that the locals, as Susanna said, really welcoming of people wanting to talk to them. But there was one objection with that, and it was probably the big guys like Channel 7, Channel 9 were out there filming houses, and then other people were actually taking photos and chucking them up on Facebook of people's houses that were burnt. Now, there was no one had gone and asked these people if that was okay or whether they're happy. And there's some of these images were on TV and people had never seen their own house burnt before it was already on TV. So there was a lot of anger about that within the local community. And I think that was a big wake-up call for me as well, in terms of that privacy issue straight afterwards is the most important.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. There's an extra element of care, isn't there? I mean, it's you and it's you looking after you. But additionally, you've also got to care, I guess, for your sources while you're covering these stories, the people who you're dealing with. And in that one-on-one, rather than, having a team of you, what guides you when you work with someone, firstly, to earn their trust and get them to open up? Are there things that you try and do before the story goes out as well as after? Susanna, perhaps to you.
Well, it's interesting what Dan said about how people opening up, because as soon as I get my notebook out, and I think it's the power of listening. As soon as you shut up and listen, people want to talk. And I've always found that one of the magic parts of being a journalist is the power of that. I think for me, I just be my authentic self. I listen. If they say something that I think, because it's a small town, that I'm aware might come back on them, I will mention that to them and say, are you sure you want to say that? I don't let people see the story, because I don't think that's a valuable thing to do, because they're thinking of themselves, not of readers. But I am very mindful that their neighbours and their friends are going to read that story. So if there's something in there that I think is too personal or could come back on them, I will mention it and check with them. So that's just, again, part of knowing your audience and just taking that care when you tell the story.
Thank you. And Nat, what about you? What are you thinking about in terms of caring for the people that you're telling these stories about in through the lens of the camera?
Yeah, I agree. I think especially in small communities, people are normally very inviting of you being there to have their story told. Yeah, and I love meeting people. That's why I do this job. So I think that, if you're genuinely interested in their story and them as a person, yeah, it's open on both fields. So you're more approachable, and I think people let you in if you are more authentic like that. Yeah, to be honest, when I was trudging around in the floods, and I had some wonderful conversations with people at the time, like amongst all the chaos and everything that was unfolding, I found people really did, because there was no other way at that stage of people getting their stories out. They really wanted to tell you what was happening. And so that made me strive. I really found that I just worked so hard because there was so much going on. I just wanted to capture images that could convey to other people the sense of what was happening as well. So I feel like that was my duty to the people that I was meeting, was just trying to make the strongest and most emotional pictures that I could.
Which you definitely managed to do. For anyone who hasn't seen them, definitely jump online and have a look. I did that yesterday. Very moving indeed, including the one behind you as your backdrop. Dan, in terms of that connection with people on the ground, do you think that there's an elevated level of trust when you're a freelancer and when you go in to tell difficult stories?
Yeah, I think there is, just because of the perceived nature of the big guys who might be just out there they're drop-ins. They drop in and they're out of there within a day. See you later. So if you're a local, I think that obviously definitely helps if you know the people. And yeah, having that, I guess that history is a big help as well. If you've been involved with your community for a long time, they know your motivations and what the stories you're able to tell and the difference you can make. And I think that's one of the big things I always approach people with, especially after disasters or loss, is how do you want to tell your story to help others? And I think that's really what our responsibility is in that sort of nature. If your stories can help one other person, then it's worth it. It's worth telling that story, as hard as it might be. There are some dangers with being in the community, I feel, in terms of getting too close. I think you have to be close. I think you have to feel the pain and feel that suffering to be able to tell a really good story. But there is, you've still got to have a little bit of that separation as well at the same time, and that can be hard.
So just on that, Dan, we're talking about, disasters which affect communities long after, the event has passed. What do you keep in mind for yourself when it comes to trauma and you're visiting a place and you are immersed in the stories? What is it that you're doing for you to, I guess, keep yourself mentally, emotionally and physically healthy?
Yeah, it's a funny one because I haven't sought any sort of professional help or anything like that over the years. And I'm sure there's a bit it's sticking there, like Susanna says, maybe haven't dealt with it at some point. But I think for me, it actually helps being involved in having those conversations and being involved like I can help. I think that's the way I feel like I can be involved with the community and help the best way. And being there, yeah, I guess being there to tell those stories. It's a funny question because I haven't talked about that much, but even just me talking to them helps me, and seeing their reaction once the story is out. So yeah, I probably don't have a huge big answer on that, but don't know if Susanna, you got any more thoughts on that?
It's interesting, the trauma, because during the floods, I got sent videos. So one of the videos was of 60 cows swimming to the house to get onto the mound, and that was a fabulous video. But I also got sent dead cows hanging in trees. I got dead horses, and I made a decision early on that I wouldn't publish any photos of dead animals. I would, like the swimming cows, I didn't mind because they made it. So in Tinny Heroes, that video is in there. So I just thought people, and for me, I can tell when I'm upset about what's going on because I'll cry at the animal stories. You know, in the floods, there were people who had to get off their roof and leave their dogs. And I'm just like bawling about these stories. So I get it out that way. I think in terms of for the readers, it's always, you know, is this in their public interest? So if it's a tough story, you still got to tell it. But like I said, I didn't need to show them pictures of dead horses, even though I could say that. In terms of looking after myself, I like to think I'm very robust emotionally and psychologically, but I'm sure I'm not. I'm sure there's a lot of denial. I don't know. Try to speak to other journalists in the area. It doesn't matter if they're with whatever organisation they're with, because I feel really only another journalist is going to understand it, because yeah, it's really complex. And I think other journalists know what you're going through, whereas my friends or my support network, it's hard because they say, well, you choose to do that and you choose to go in there. And or when I've been at a screening of Tinny Heroes and someone comes up and is crying and I'm hugging them and they somehow feel very connected to me because I made that film, but I don't know them. And I can hug them. I don't know what else to do except I'm big on validation. But in terms of myself, I most probably don't do a great job of that. I'd love any tips. Natalie might have some.
Natalie, you're the last one for us to come to. So
Tell us what to do, Natalie.
That's right.
I'm going to say the same as you guys. I really don't think about it very much. Yeah, I guess to me, when I'm out taking photos, like when I have that camera up, it's almost like this invisible barrier to, you're still feeling things, but it's almost like this protection piece that you put on you, like it's not really you as well. So I don't know. Maybe I am carrying a lot of trauma that I don't deal with, but I don't feel like I am. I feel like by being out there and telling the story is, to me, that feels healthier than not being out there and telling the story. So yeah, I feel like I don't have an answer for that one either.
Can I ask maybe a question in a minute? Sorry, go on. I wanted to ask about your picture you took of Peter, you know, that you won the award for, the guy sitting in the chair.
Oh, yeah, Peter, yeah.
And obviously you can see the pain in his face. Like that's a really striking image because he's sitting in the chair. So how do you feel maybe later when you are out of the situation and you're safe at home and you look at that photo, which, you know, you must have known was an amazing picture, but how do you feel about it, looking at it?
Well,
now?
For me, I felt like that was the one photo that could really convey what I was seeing. So I was happy that had been captured. I mean, I wasn't happy of Peter's circumstances, but I felt like his pain was just, it was kind of an expression of everybody's pain that I was seeing. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it's a very moving picture, and especially to know, like, Peter, you know, he has had it tough. He's still doing it really tough. But that's the story. That's his, it's not just his story. It was the story of, like, it's still the story of so many people in these areas. Yeah.
Thanks. And great question.
Can I just add to that as well that you know, and for us and for everyone who's dealt with all this, 3 to 5 years down the track is the danger time for PTSD and depression and suicide. So talking about continuing on these stories, I think now is important more than ever, to rekindle and retouch on some of them and make sure people are okay. And that's another responsibility as well.
Thank you, Dan. And just a reminder, and the Walkley has just popped something in the chat there, but the DART Centre is available, of course, to all of us, and they have some really great resources on trauma and reporting. I'd like to say, though, that even having this open conversation and between the three of you, even if you don't have the world's greatest tips to give out, it's obviously something that you're at least mindful of, and I think that's probably where it starts, isn't it? And knowing that you can have a conversation with someone if you need to. I'd like to just shift gear a little bit. A big part of freelancing is, of course, being able to sell you and sell your stories. Generally speaking, not the thing that journalists are so great at, but what tips do you have around how and where you pitch your coverage? Nat, to you first.
Oh, I was hoping to hear tips from the others on this, because I'm not the best at pitching stories. I'm kind of lucky that a lot of stories just land on my lap, and Yeah, so I'd probably like a few tips from the others on how they go about pitching their stories, especially their film projects.
Well, Dan, should we come to you then? How do you go about undertaking something and finding a home for it?
Apart from the money making, this is the hardest thing, especially pitching films. It can be a very, very tough thing, is just finding money for films. But I think as a regional journalist and you're embedded in the community, the selling point is obviously you're the only one who can get this story. You're the only one who knows these people. You're the only one who's embedded in the community. The film I've just made about the Kangaroo Island plantations could only have been made for me being here, because the simple fact is that I need to spend a year making it, and no journalist or news organization is going to send you in for a year to cover it. So being in that situation and I guess having those contacts and being able to tell the story right from the source, I think is a big selling point for editors. I mean, it obviously helps if you know that I've written a few stories for the Tiser, and it helps that I've worked for the Tiser, the advertiser. So I've got that history there. But I guess if you're starting out and you're in this regional area, I think identifying yourself as something unique, because a lot of these areas will have, as Susanna will know, they've got their own journalists and own newsrooms. There is a journalist who works here at the local paper, but he's so busy. He's working on, the community stories and what's going on in the community. He doesn't have time to cover the big stories, the broader issues, things that happen over a lengthy period of time, and being able to say, I can write a 2,000 word feature story right now for you, and commit to that. And so the local journalist wouldn't have that opportunity. So I guess that's where a freelancer can sort of make themselves different, identify them as a different area of journalism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great tip. So the uniqueness of what you do and where you are. Susanna, to you, any tips around how to pitch your coverage outside of, and I'd love to talk more in a moment about IndieNR, but just outside of that in a freelance capacity?
I was going to say, start your own website and then you don't have to pitch to anyone. But apart from that, I have contacted when I had some good flood stories and when I have other stories that I think are unique to what I'm doing, like because I'm in beef country and different stories, I have pitched them to The Guardian, because I'm surprised that some of the big news organisations don't use regional journalists more, in terms of, because I know the cost cutting and all of that they don't use us more. But I actually haven't had any joy in pitching my stories to The Guardian or anywhere else. But obviously I don't do a lot of pitching because I publish them on my website. But during the floods, for instance, when there weren't many or the journalists couldn't get up here, and I know at the time it was the Ukraine war and Shane Warne died, so it took a while for mainstream media to get on board with the floods. I was on radio, TV, about 4 or 5 times talking about the floods because they didn't have regional journalists up here, but didn't get paid for any of that. So I don't know how you make that jump. And when I was freelance before I had a website, I found the always selling really difficult, because you might have a great idea. You've got to find someone who's going to publish it. I don't have that issue now with my own website, but I have the issue of I also have to sell advertising, which pays my wages. So it's I'm still selling, even though it's not something I'm comfortable with.
It is an interesting thing because, as I said, I think broadly we're not really comfortable with the sell, but it has to be done when you are a freelancer. Susanna, just talking about that time prior to IndieNR, but do you find that when you're pitching inside an organisation where it's almost a fait accompli if the story's got a decent hook and it's got some great pictures for say a print outlet, that it will get over the line, but as a freelancer it's just a sort of an even bigger step up?
I think as a freelancer, your pitch has got to be better. I think if you're a freelancer, you have to be better than what they've got in their office of journalists. And I think that's a good thing. You've got to always try to be better. I follow a whole lot of different journalists that I think do great writing to see what they're doing. I think the hook is everything. I think if you don't have the best picture or the headline, it's all about the hook, and it has to be absolutely unique and just fantastic. If you want to be heard, you've got to be better and better and better all the time. So I think as a freelancer, you can never be complacent about your idea. Whereas when you work for a big news organization, you'd run it by your editor and it'd be, it's a slow news day, go and do, the abandoned kittens. you're not always having to come up with the greatest idea. And I think as a freelancer, I always felt I had to come up with something amazing to be heard.
Dan, any other tips that you'd like to add for Nat and everyone who's watching today?
Yeah, well, I guess if you're building up to a bigger story or a bigger film, I think having done some of the work first, I mean, I know that's really annoying and it's the hardest thing to do because you're not getting paid for it. But if you've got, certainly for film, if you've got imagery that nobody else has got, if you've spent that time to go do that first, then that's obviously going to help you in your selling point and finding a home for something. And like I say, just having the contacts that the stories, if you're in the local community, stories that nobody else knows. So yeah, like I said, they're the main points for me.
Thanks.
I'd just like to add too, it's probably about also building those relationships with the editors. I know as a photographer, really building the relationship with pick editors so that they do know your work and they do trust you. And yeah, so that would probably be my biggest tip as well.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a really great list, from uniqueness to niches to contacts to building relationships to finding sort of, I guess, the coverage that's not actually happening, that you can fill that spot. Nat, I might just stay with you. What is the landscape like at the moment for freelancers? I mean, are you finding that there's greater competition than there has been? And what are the opportunities like to find places for your content and for your stories?
Yeah, I do think it's getting tougher. But in saying that, my work really just focuses on the Northern Rivers. I do travel a little bit outside of that sometimes. It's a very interesting area. And lucky for me, there aren't a lot of people that specialize in photojournalism up here. A lot of photographers up here are mainly lifestyle shooters. So there's probably only 3 or 4 of us around that are interested in actually capturing news and editorial. So that makes things a little bit easier. But yeah, it is tough to pitch stories and find space for your work. That seems to be dwindling. That's why I'm all ears for any more tips on that. But yeah.
And it sounds like carving out the niche for you. So, this is the thing that I, want to focus on, whether it's human interest or people stories, that, people get to know you for that and become the go-to for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do a lot of stories in the Byron area. So I feel like when anything's happening there, I'm often called, and I know I've got contacts and I often know what kind of image people are looking for and where to go and how to find that. And yeah, that all helps.
Susanna, for you, you've started your website, so you have a real focus now. Do you find that that freelancers come to you knocking on your door?
They do, and I particularly use them for breaking news because I can't be everywhere, because really it's just me doing that. I'm the only journalist, and I have a sub-editor, and I have lots of contributors from the community who are unpaid, who do all sorts of things. But for breaking news, if I see it on Instagram or Facebook and it's a local photographer, I will ask to use it. Sometimes I use it for free. Sometimes I've been able to pay them a pittance, I have to say. I hate asking them if I can use it for free, because I think that's wrong, but sometimes I've had to. When I can pay them, I will pay them. So that's more for breaking news, because I can't, if there's an accident and I can't get there. So I do have a lot of freelancers come and ask if I can use their work. I don't have the funds to pay them what they are worth, unfortunately. Hopefully, we've been going 2 years now with the website. I'm hoping I do, or when I get a grant, I will definitely, I pay photographers, and I have done that. So it's about having enough money to pay them, and I hate not paying them, because they've got to buy food and feed the dogs.
Oh, absolutely. I think that financial imperative is probably the biggest thing when it comes to being a freelancer. Why don't we head in that direction? And I want to talk to all of you about how you look after yourself financially, everything from keeping afloat, day to day, to covering those times when there isn't a lot of work around, as well as future proofing. Dan, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, well, just harping back to your other question there about the space that we live in at the moment with what I feel like, yes, it's still really hard for freelancers, but I feel there is a big opening there and a change, obviously, with the carve out of, so many media at the moment. That freelance is almost more important, I feel, because we need really good journalists out there covering stories that these big organizations out for anymore, which they used to do a lot more. So I think that's a real opportunity for freelancers, and I find that exciting. In terms of keeping going, like I mentioned, it's balls in the air, to be honest. Having multiple balls in the air at the same time is a big thing. I sort of have ideas running through my head continually about what's next and what can we be working on in the meantime, while we're waiting for money to come through. So ideas for writing has been good, and films, obviously. I sort of share my time between making independent films, and as I said earlier, I've made make little promo films for small businesses or work for government, do a little bit of stuff for them to keep the money rolling in. And actually lately, as I said, I worked full-time for 8 years, and then lately I've taken 2 days of work at a government organisation here doing their media and comms. So I think inevitably most people will find they have to do that. They have to supplement, if they're working a full freelance, have to supplement with some other work. And that might be hard for people. They might not want to do that, but to me, that's the reality of being able to, especially if you've got a family. I think if you're on your own, it's a bit easier. You can commit all your time to the work you want to do. But obviously having a little bit of a backup work in your field, I think, is important. You can go and do something else, but if it's not progressing your learning and progressing your experience, doesn't really help. I don't feel that way. So if you can stay within the media sort of comms realm, I think that obviously helps as well.
Yeah, great. Nat, what about you looking after yourself financially, as I say, from day to day, right through to, what does it look like in 20 years?
Yeah, oh gosh, I don't know what it's going to look like in 20 years, but yeah, it's a juggling act. I think you do have to juggle a few different things on the side if you want to make a go at being a freelancer. So I do, family portraits, all different kinds of things. I work at a community magazine 1 day a week writing. And the other thing that I was going to touch on is also about because you often hear when you get called for a job, we'll pay the half-day rate, and we've only got this budget, blah, blah, blah. As I always try and fight to try and be paid a full day's rate, because I just think that it's fair that if you're going to make yourself available whenever at the drop of a hat, and you might get called quite often, I think it's fair to fight for that full day rate, even though you may only be doing a job for a couple of hours. So that's another thing that I'm trying to get tougher on. And I wish everybody else would too. So, but yeah, I just think that it's fair. Like many times you're available like as soon as they call, and I kind of schedule my other work life around that availability. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a premium for having you on the books, isn't it?
Well,
it
should be.
And I guess it's also about that business of being a freelancer, that you're not just a journalist out there, taking photos or writing stories, but you're running an actual business. The business is you. Yeah. So all those other overheads that, when you're not a freelancer, you really don't think about. Susanna, you'd know that super well, but with even things like insurance, the keeping equipment up to date, websites, etc. So for you, how do you look after yourself financially?
Oh, that's such a big, hard question.
Sorry.
I manage, because I get paid basically from the advertising on my website. So I have advertisers there with the local stories, and I love doing the news stories. So I'm always got time. I've got to do some more stories. So I do about 4 a day. But I have to stop to that sometimes and go, Susanna, if you want to do the news stories, you've got to spend a few hours selling ads, which I don't love doing. But I've tried to see it more as I have this news site that people are coming to because local news, and I can offer you promotion there rather than selling, because that's not a hat I particularly like to wear. But I am aware if I don't do some of the tough stuff, I can't do my news. So I would live very frugally, I would say, to keep me going. And like I always say to myself, look, you love your job, you're managing to live off it, survive off it, and that's a good thing. I don't want to go back to teaching, or I don't want to go and do other things, because I find I'm just a big believer in what you focus on grows. So for me, it's growing that website so that it supports me and eventually can support another journalist, because I don't have any future proofing. I have zero. If I go down sick, I have nothing, no future proofing. So I'm very aware, from a business point of view, that's not a good thing. And it's something I'm working on, because I need a plan B. I do need some future proofing, and I need to be bringing in enough money for that. So I'm working on it. It's a work in progress, that one.
I totally agree that it grows organically, doesn't it? If you've got the passion for it and you love what you're doing, then things do just happen for you. And that might sound the frugal thing to say, but it does. Things do sometimes fall in your lap when you're working so hard and showing your passion for it. I can just say one more thing as a filmmaker, for people who have been filmmaking or haven't, always to keep sort of some kind of contingency cash at the end, because things just pop up that, especially mainly in film, that just the costs are just crazy. You might just need to buy a new hard drive. It costs you another $250, or I've just literally experienced myself sending through to Foxtel, and then I totally forgot, they require captions for the whole thing. So it's 80 minutes of captions that I've got to pay for now. I could do it all myself, but I just do not have the time to do 80 minutes of captions. So that's another $300 that you just got to keep in mind. And if you don't have that sort of contingency money at the end, you end up in the red again.
Dan, sorry, go, Susanna.
I was just going to say, on the film thing, I had no idea about the film industry. Like, I was doing interviewing people about being saved in their tinnies, and I couldn't believe the stories I was hearing. And I just thought, this is so Australian, this is so heroic. I'm going to make a film. And of course, there's a wonderful naivety when you've never made a film. Like, how hard can it be? So I get my 10,000 grant, and that all went to the cameraman, and he also helped produce and edit the film. And the rest I did for nothing. I just really wanted to make this film, and it was really hard. It was wonderful, but it was really, really, really hard. I had no idea what was involved in making a film, and the costs, and how much, like when you get the story, when you go out and do a story, you take the photo, I've already packaging it in my head on the way home. I've got total control of how I present that story with what I've got. Whereas doing a film, when I got this theme song, when we interviewed another person, every single photo I chose to go in that film changed everything. And there were other people involved. So I admire that you can get a film out there and sell it, because I only know now how and my film was only 20 minutes long, and it was like having twins.
It is a bit like that. And I got to say, having done film for 8 years, and I came back to doing some writing for the Tizer, and I was like, oh wow, that was a lot easier. Not that writing's easy, but in terms of just making sure technology is working and going through all that process, it's a whole.
You don't need much. You just need your computer or a pen.
That's right, exactly.
Susanna, thanks for sharing that. I think one of the realities is being a freelancer is the freedom to try and do all sorts of things, but also the huge amount of learning that happens as a result of that when you dip your toe into waters that you might not have before. And I think collectively we've all definitely been there. Dan, I just want to dig in a little bit more around those particular challenges of filmmaking. Susanna having made one herself, you clearly are in the midst of releasing yours, and Nat was saying earlier that she's now studying filmmaking. You need a lot of funding and a lot of inputs from others. So when you're producing something over a long period of time, how do you sustain that effort? And you mentioned keeping a bit to the end so that you for contingency, but what else has to happen? I mean, it's not a week-long project or a day-long project.
Yeah, that's right. Again, I think, for this project, I sort of filmed it sort of over a year or so. And I think the big thing is obviously to make sure you've got time to do the editing, because the editing, it took me probably four months of editing just to put it together. I think, the motivation just to keep going is just to make it the best you can. I think there's easier ways to make things that aren't going to get the attention and aren't going to get you across the line with getting noticed. But committing yourself to the full story and the imagery. I think the first point is to make sure you've got the people locked in terms of interviews and your storylines and your characters. And then the rest is sort of, I feel like, is polishing and putting, icing on the cake with the imagery and how you want it to look and the beauty that you want to get out of it. So it's, yeah, it is a long, I've worked mostly on my own. It's probably not advice for people to work completely on your own as a filmmaker, but to me, if maybe it's the freelancer in me that I kind of want sort of full control over it. You know, I've got a drone operator to help me out and a few other people to help me with filming every now and then. But they are costs. You've got to factor that in with bringing other people in. So if you're an independent filmmaker, I think probably at the end, my advice would be to have an editor. I actually haven't really done that in the past in terms of having an editor just committed to doing it. And they can obviously, you know, I feel editing is very personal, so you can bring out the story you want, but then also you are maybe too close to the story at many times as well. So having an editor to come in and have new eyes on it to see it differently is really important. So if you've got the money for that, I would definitely recommend that. And some other big things is sound and color. And color is not something I realized when I first moved into it that there would be such a thing, but mainly I film now in a neutral color, which means you have to color every single image. So, and that's a huge time. And if you're not that great in it, which I'm probably not the best, but I've learned over the years, that's another cost factor you've really got to keep in mind. So a lot of these things are, the money for filmmaking is in a commission. So if you go and find a story and you sell it before you make the film, that's the only way you're going to really find money. If you're lucky enough to get a grant, which I have through the Walkley Foundation for this particular film, a big enough grant that can keep you going, that's great. But if you're trying to sell a film at the end, which is called an acquisition, absolutely zero money in it. So just an example, Foxtel bought the last couple of films off me for $5,000. These are feature films. So that's the maximum you're going to get. And that's pretty normal for the industry. So all that is really just probably covering your expenses at the end that I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
Wow, Dan, that's quite fascinating. A lot of love and passion, I guess, you get paid for in place of many, many dollars. Right. I'm curious if any of you have ever used Patreon or any other fundraising platforms for coverage. And if so, any tips for managing that kind of income, or have you even looked into it and seen if it's a viable option?
No, not me.
No.
No, the one thing I know is a documentary. Documentary Australia it's people who donate through Documentary Australia to your films. It's a tax-free. What's the word? Tax-free tax return on your donation. So that's one way of doing it. If as filmmakers with a story that's either environmental or social justice or things like that. And that's one recommended place I'd say to go.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And look, if I take us back to, when you've been reporting in the midst of a natural disaster, where do you find time for the administration and finances amid everything that's going on and reporting on those? Nat, to you first.
Not to way after. Yeah, it's not really something I'm thinking about at the time, especially with the floods. It's just catch-up work. Lucky for me, I wasn't so much having to come home and sell images because I was already being assigned. So it's just a matter of, spending a day sending out invoices and things like that. Yeah, which was pretty easy, but left till later on down the track.
Again, it's something, outside the freelance world that someone else is looking after, that someone else is worrying about while you're focusing on the job. Susanna, you're nodding. What's your experience in that space?
Well, I think be set up beforehand, because when you're reporting on a disaster, you don't have time for anything else. So all that stuff, if it's chugging along and it's set up, it doesn't matter if you leave it for a month because you're busy covering the disaster. Like my sub-editor made me get zero, for instance, so that when I send out invoices, it's really easy for me now, but that took a lot of setup. But of course, now it's set up, it takes me very little time. So you do have to put aside time, but when you're reporting on the disaster, I don't think that is the time to do it. It happens in your, I hesitate to say quiet time or downtime, but there, like at the moment, there's not a disaster raging. There's lots of news stories. So use that time well to set up your finances or set up whatever admin. I mean, there's just social media accounts. There's so many things around journalism that you have to do, including your new ideas. Like I always have, I'm crazy. I always have these ideas in my head, and I have one that I want to talk to Daniel about after this, about APY lands. but I've got all these things in my head, and I have to have a good talk with myself and go, no, you can't do that one. You can't do that one. You might be able to do this one. And so I find all of that bubbles in my quieter times, and I have to go, okay, what do I need to do to be ready for, say I want to embark on a big project as well as keep my news site going. I have to plan for that, because when it happens, you are so caught up in it. So I think any structure or foundation you have helps you when you're really busy.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, probably I'm a bit the same. That's one of the things I don't focus on enough. But I think my advice would just be to do it as much as you can while you're doing it. So say if you are on a long project, if you can keep on top of it while you're moving through, you're filing everything and making sure you got things in place. Because the worst in the past is I've come to the end of the financial year and it's just this pile of mess that you just do not want to deal with, and it takes up way too much time than it needs to. So being aware of that, I think, is the most important thing.
Yeah, great. And as storytellers and being immersed in making content, finances and business, I don't know about you guys, but sort of the last thing on the list, just because it's, I don't know, it's just not as sexy as the stuff that we do, right? In a moment, we're going to take some questions from the floor. So if you've joined us for this webinar with our fabulous panelists today, and you have a question, please pop it in the chat and we'll come to that, and I'll put it to either one or all of our guests. Just to finish that conversation around the business of freelancing, are there systems or resources around that either helped you initially or have helped you now sort of get established or support you when you have decided to move into the freelance world, in the world of business, doing the business of freelancing, Susanna?
Well, like I said, having a financial program like Xero means that I can put all my expenses in there. I learned how to use Excel. So just keeping track of things, any of those programs are good, as opposed to the bits of paper in the shoebox like I used to do. That just causes too much stress. I have a really great accountant who I ask him to do way more than he should. So all of that has really helped me with my business side. I try to look at where my weaknesses are. And of course, making content is great fun, no problem. But the other stuff, I try to find people who can help me and help me set stuff up, because if I have a weakness and I don't tackle it, it's not going to get any better. So any structure you can get that helps you is a good thing. And a good accountant is essential.
Yes, I would agree with that one as well. I think I asked mine to do way more than he's supposed to be doing. Nat, what about you? What have you got in place that helps you around the business of freelancing?
Yeah, I'm same, weak spot for me, but I think, yeah, having a program, as you said, to keep track of things is a life changer, and a good accountant. So I'm the same. It's definitely not my strong point, and I hate doing it. I find it really boring, but I have been at the end of the financial year scrambling before, trying to find bits of paper and all that stuff. So trying not to do that is my main mission now.
Yes.
It ends up taking weeks instead of what could be like a day.
Which then cuts into that time when you could also be working, isn't it? It's, yeah.
Nightmare.
Absolutely. Dan, you're working on long projects a lot of the time. Does that make you more organised than the average freelancer?
Probably has. I've probably been pretty unorganized in the past, but I've sort of learned in the last few years to really get organized. And maybe in the filmmaking field, having a producer who you can go and talk to, that's probably a really good advice in terms of making a bigger film. Just because they can focus you in on what's important and what have you got everything in place, and producers do handle a lot of that admin side of things as well, and sort of budgets and contracts and things like that. So if you do have the money to hand off a lot of those things, that's a huge deal, a huge advantage.
Susanna mentioned before talking about, what the next story is or the next project. And it really is a case of the world is your oyster when you're a freelancer at times. How difficult is it, making those decisions? Kind of, what are you thinking about in weighing up whether it's something that you are going to take on, or an idea that you might have had in the middle of the night is something that you need to pursue, versus something else that might be more practicable or more financially, rewarding for you? Dan, I might start with you. What is that choice process like?
Yeah, that's a good one, because I find with freelancing that I do a story and it weirdly leads to the next story. There's this natural progression where someone contact says something to you, you talk to, and you move to that story, or it naturally progresses to something else. Which is kind of what I found on Kangaroo Island. I sort of wrote stories about we lost a community member to suicide here, and I ended up writing a story with his family about what that was like and why they thought it happened, and why the community didn't see it happening. And then it led to how is the mental health of the island, how is the island dealing with it as a community and trying to prevent this from happening again. And then the fires, obviously the big story with the fires has led to the outcome with the plantations on Kangaroo Island and the huge waste of resources from that. So it's felt like, those sort of natural progressions in the stories just, I guess emerge in that way. But it is hard, I guess. There's certain stories that and it's almost like talking to other people in the industry, and maybe an editor that what is this story going to sell in the first place? I'm not going to go out and spend all my time, preparing this when that's not a story they're interested in, going down that line. I think you need to be really aware and knowing the selling point for it before you go and do that hard work to get it going.
So that is the reality, isn't it? There needs to be that financial imperative that plays some role while you keep the flexibility of being able to enjoy that creativity that you hope for. Susanna, how do you weigh up what comes next in and around Indy, which you obviously are doing full time?
Most of it's to do with what is time bound. So if it's hard news and there's a car crash, that goes up immediately. If it's a profile, I'll juggle it. I try to cover different parts of the community. So your arts community, your farming. So I have different stories. I also really focus on making sure I cover the geography. So the little town, I haven't done a story in Woodinbong for a while. I need to get there and find something there. I do have a rule, like Dan said, where each story leads to another. I have a rule in my head when I go out that I always must come back with another story, a new story. And usually you come back with several. So there's geography, different parts of the community, whether it's hard or soft news. But I'm terrible if I have a real passion for something, like when I did for Tinny Heroes. I just go bugger it. I don't care what the cost is, what the time is, and my children are all grown up, so I can work till, I can, burn the midnight oil. I don't have to get up for kids' lunches, make kids' lunches. So if I have a real passion for it, like I did with Tinny Heroes, I just throw out all the things I should consider, and I just go for it. And I generally find that works really well for me. I know it's maybe not a good tip, but it works pretty good for me.
No, I love the different approach. And Nat, what about you? How do you balance off the creative versus the must-dos?
Well, I think it is a balancing act. You have to take those practical jobs. Like, sometimes I take jobs and I'm really not interested in the story, but it's paying, so I go and do it. But I think if you're going to pursue your own story, you have to be really passionate about it, because it might not sell. But in saying that, I think the funniest thing is any of the projects that I've pursued on my own, because I've been passionate about, are probably the projects that have got the most interest, because I think that passion takes the story to a next level, and people pick up on that and they do become popular. So that would be my advice. I think even though it can be fearful spending all this time on doing a story where you don't know if it's going to sell, that probably shouldn't be the main point on why you're pursuing it in the first place.
Thank you all. And some really interesting perspectives and great tips there. We are going to wrap very shortly. I haven't seen any questions yet come through from the floor, but if anybody does have one, now's the time to pop that one in chat and we'll come to it. But I would like to finish my line of questioning with you all with this question. And really it's around the thing that all journalists strive for, and that's impact. So knowing that your reporting is making a difference or having an effect on the people in either communities or people that you're talking to. Dan, first to you, how do you know when your reporting has done that, has made a difference to the community that you're telling the story on behalf of?
I've probably seen a really good example of that just with the story, like I mentioned earlier, about the loss of one of our community members here to a suicide. And it's sort of the basis of the story is that we need to talk more as a community. And, you know, how did this happen? How did this sort of, nobody saw it coming. And so Facebook pages started cropping up about people getting together and wanting to talk about it. And there was much more openness about, you know, mental health first aid and basically getting blokes to talk. There was the farmers over here who have opened up. And it's amazing after writing the story and you get the messages back saying, oh, thank you so much for writing this story. It means so much that you're in the community telling these stories. And that really shocked me, because you kind of feel like sometimes you write stories and you don't really know who reads it and who's out there and is there an impact being made. But to see that impact come back straight away just shows that, you know, that kind of publicity for that kind of issue is so vital. So yeah, I think that's what we've all got to remember. It's, you know, you might get down, sometimes it might be hard to sell stories, you might be having a bit of trouble with it, but if you've, you know, those are the things that make it worthwhile in the end, to make a difference to one person, like I said earlier. And that's the message that came across with people who were talking to me about it as well, saying, look, if I want to say this and I want to be open about it and be fragile, because I just want to help one other person at least.
Yeah, beautiful example of that. Nat, to you, when have you known that your reporting has helped or has made a difference to a community that you've been working within?
Well, going back to the image of Peter, actually, when that was published in the Saturday paper, the editor actually did a really kind thing, and he sent me a whole heap of emails, feedback that he got from that image about how, you know, how, you know, that image had made them think about the floods and all different kinds of stories that people had wrote in about. And same thing with The Guardian. I think a story that we covered, then that person or that organisation received, I think, $12,000 in, you know, contributions from readers and things like that. So I think, yeah, that's one way that I've noticed the impact, is when the editors actually let you know, or the journalist gets back to you to tell you these are the positive things that have happened from that. Apart from something like the floods, just being in the community and people telling you, you know, or you send the photos on to the people and they're like very grateful that their story was out, and it could have helped reach wider audiences at that stage when they felt like the government and nobody was listening to them. So that was impactful to hear that straight from community members.
Absolutely. And why
don't editors do that? Can I just say that's a message to editors, anyone's listening. Would they send out more of these responses to journalists? Because I think that's a motivating factor.
I guess they probably don't have time, but I guess so. It was like one of the first times I felt like editors actually spent time doing that. So that was nice, actually, because you don't always get that. You never know what's happened to that photo, and, you know, did it make any change, or so it was good to know that there were these good things happening from the images.
Yeah, absolutely, Nat, and what an image that one was in particular. And Susanna, to you, so the impact, I imagine that you're doing that on a, you know, daily, weekly basis with indianr.com, the reason that you started it in the first place. But how do you genuinely know when you're making a difference to your community?
Oh, they tell you all the time. I can't believe how much feedback you get. Obviously, when I'm out and about, they thank me or say, oh, I read your story, etc. But of course, one of the things we haven't touched on is social media, which is vital if you're a freelancer. So on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, particularly in this area, Facebook's big. You get so many comments of people thanking you for doing the job, thanking you for that story. So I get a lot of validation back. And an interesting thing, and Dan would know this, is when you write a story or take a photograph and put it out there, people view it when you're not there, and then they let you know on Facebook or they send me an email. So I get lots of that. But doing the film was the first time that I watched them watching what I'd made. So that was I was just about out of my skin the first time, because I was very nervous about the launch. Was on the anniversary of the floods, the 1-year anniversary. And it was at Woodburn Hall. There were about 400 people there. And these are people who'd been through the floods. And I was firstly overwhelmed that they'd all turned up. And of course, very nervous of them watching the film. And it's a really different experience because you get to watch your creativity being viewed by others, especially for people who it was intended for. And they gave a standing ovation at the end. They stood up and I was totally overwhelmed, but it gave me a lot of confidence because I thought, if they like it, I'm good. And I couldn't have asked for a better response to that. So in the country, they tell you if they don't like it, you know, they tell you if they think you got it wrong, or I think you're being one-sided on that story, or why aren't you doing X, Y, Z? So they tell me all the time. So you don't even have to go looking for it. You know, when you do your shopping, someone will come up and go, oh, hi, and they'll talk to you. And of course, I always say to them, look, I don't remember the names, but tell me the story. I'll always remember the story. And then they want to talk about that particular story. So yeah, everywhere you go, people were giving you feedback, and I love it. I think it's great because you're not hidden in some office somewhere. They tell you all the time. It's great.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. Look, I think that's probably the perfect place to end our amazing discussion today. I want to thank all of you so much for your time and for your generosity in sharing your experiences and your stories.
For having us, appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure. And you can find out a lot more about all three of today's panelists. Nat has her website, nataliegrono.com. Susanna, you can find her work at indynr.com. And Dan Clark, search Lost in the Woods. It's ad hoc docs that you run under. Yes.
Right.
And there's a Facebook page.
August 15, I'll get my plug in. August 15, Foxtel and Binge.
Fantastic. Very, very proud. Fellow South Australian, extremely proud, but we're all very, very proud of you. So thank you all so much. And also thank you to Media Super for supporting conversations like this one for journalists. The Walkley Foundation will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with some further resources, including a free webinar next week, which is led by Media Super's Stephen Smith, where you can ask more detailed questions about your super. Other than that, thank you. I've been Caroline Winter. It's been great to be with you for the last hour and a half, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.